Welcome back to Fantasy 1.0. Today we're going to talk about managing your team through the first quarter of the baseball season. I did throw a pen.
Put your seatbelt on and yield for the apocalypse, yeah. It's the apocalypse, yeah.
So you thought you were going to go flying out of the gate, head to head, you're going to be beating all of your opponents, rotisserie, you're going to be first in every category. And I'll bet you it didn't quite end up like that. So it didn't for me in a lot of leagues either. So let me just tell you some rules of thumb and strategies I employ in the first 40 games of the season, first month of the season. So first one, I say it all the time, but don't freak out. Don't start losing your mind and dropping Ian Happ and Tanaka and replacing them with a bunch of scrubs because they've had a bad couple weeks. Rule of thumb number one for me is if I drafted outside of extenuating circumstances like Tommy John surgery for pitchers or something crazy, if you were drafted in the first 12 rounds, if your player was drafted in the first 12 rounds, do not drop him, no matter what. Just keep them on your team and stay the course, at least until the end of the first week of May. Last year, because they started a week early, I'm doing that. It used to be mid-May for me. So you need a big enough sample size to know what's going on. You spend a lot of draft capital on these individuals, and you're not going to get them any value for them via trade. And if you just drop them, somebody's going to pick them right back up, put them on the bench, and if they start performing how they were drafted, then you stand to lose quite a bit. On the flip side of this, you need to be aggressively, so right now, you need to be aggressively looking on the waiver wire and listening to my show about players that you need to be picking up. So these tend to be younger players. Look at Aaron Judge and Luis Severino last year. Another couple of guys I go on and on about. But if you pick these players up, the ones that were undrafted or picked at the very end of drafts, if even, just keep your eye out for these guys because these are the ones, and I've got another episode coming up talking about who some of these guys are. Pick them up, put them on your roster. So if you've got an end of draft sort of scrub sitting there and you see somebody's lighting it up, look at the third baseman for San Diego, Villanueva, pick them up and just, put them on the end of your bench and just see how that goes. But be aggressive. And so that's with your waiver fab. If you remember, that's your free agent acquisition budget. Spend liberally right now. Don't go crazy, but spend liberally because if you get a player that's a hit, you get to enjoy him for the rest of the season. If you spend your fab budget, 20 games left in the season and get a player, he's not going to be of much value to you in the grand scheme of things. So, spend a lot and spend early and spend aggressively. One thing I like to do as well is if I've got a player that's not performing well, and this could even sort of come into the conversation later on when when you start considering dropping players that, like your Ian Happs that you were expecting more from. Ask yourself this question. If I saw this player on the waiver wire, would I go after him and pick him up? Because a lot of times you're going to say yes. That means everybody else in your league who's going to be jumping to grab that player, that high ceiling player, and put them under the end of your bench, maybe you shouldn't drop them in the first place. So before, learning that the hard way, just pause and ask yourself that question. Should I be dropping this player or would I be rushing to pick him up if I was any other team in this league? Okay, so another thing is you're going to be now starting to feel the pinch of, I've asked you to hold on to Nick Senzel and Willie Calhoun and some of these guys that aren't quite up yet. Obviously, Ronald Acuna. So let's start with the rookies and the NA players, the guys with the NA designation because they're not up in the bigs yet. The best advice I can give is, you've dug in now, you've held on to them for this long. I would say continue to do it because now you've held on to let's say you held on to Senzel for 2-3 weeks now and you drop him in a week, he's going to get, I guarantee you he'll get called up 2 days later and some other manager's going to come in and swoop him up. So just hold on to him if you've got the roster space. If you're really, really in a pinch, okay, I can maybe justify you dropping them, but that would have to be because you're overwhelmed with hurt players, which brings me to the DL situation. So as you know, the DL stints have gone down from 15 games to 10 games, which means it's a lot more tantalizing for teams to just shelf a player for 10 days. It's only a little over a week. So if they're on the fence about whether or not this guy's going to take a break on the DL because he's hurt, he's got a nagging injury, they're just going to put him on there. I've got some teams right now where I've got 5-6 players on my disabled list. So this comes into the pinch and this you know, of weighing your bench with, do you want your bench to be an infirmary with all these hurt players, or do you want some not so talented players to fill out that bench? And again, you answer that question with roster composition. How many spots do you have on your bench? Because I don't want you to, you got to walk that line. You have to keep your quality players that are on the disabled list if you see them coming off in the foreseeable future. But you also need enough players to fill in for the other guys who maybe have off days and so on. You want to be running with a full roster as well. So this is up to you, but you've got to walk that line, and it all really comes down to your roster composition and what your DL list looks like right now. Your bullpen situation. So right now, you're probably, hopefully, well, if you employed my strategy, you're probably in the hunt for saves. You're doing well, you're competing in saves, but you're also, remember, on the lookout for the next guy up. So you got to look at like Shane Green in Detroit, that took me a second, or Fernando Rodney, who's always an adventure in Minnesota. This is where you start looking at, okay, wait a minute, is it time to start picking up, you know, the replacement, the Joe Jimenez, and all those players that maybe are the next guy up? So start considering that too. And again, that comes up to how much bench space you have, how well you're doing in saves, and how many bench spots you can allocate to those, you know, relief type pitchers. All right, so we've talked about adding players and dropping players and how to manage DL and your NA, you know, your rookies that are sitting on your bench and your bullpen. So let's talk about some trades. So no matter what you're in, if you're in head-to-head, you're in rotisserie, if you're not in points, you're going by categories, then more likely than not, unfortunately, you're going to be deficient in a certain, you know, in a number of categories, and you're hopefully going to be excelling in a couple others as well. So now is about the time that you can take a step back. You've got a large enough sample size that you can look at these categories and start to identify your strengths and weaknesses. Now, don't just look at, okay, I'm last in steals and think, oh, woe is me, I'm screwed. I've got to start, you know, scouring the waiver wire or trying to make trades for saves, because maybe you've got Delano DeShields on your bench, or maybe you got Juan Moncada, who's actually starting to steal bases. I think he's stolen a base in his past 3 or 4 games. So don't just look at a category that you're suffering in, but look at your roster and think, can I make this up with what I have, with what I currently have? Are there players on, you know, that I have on my team that are going to step up? Are there players that are coming off the DL that I have that are going to, you know, something's going to happen with them? Like Shields becomes, when he's back, he's going to be batting at the top of the order, hopefully, like the original plan was, and he's going to swipe still probably 30 bags. Now, if you don't have this available, you know, this ability to make up for this lost ground on your bench or coming off the DL, it's time to start thinking about trades. The first thing you want to do is you want to look at your strengths and your weaknesses, which you've done, and now you need to look at your competing teams' rosters. So start looking at these other teams, and actually don't just look at the categories and the scores. Look at their physical roster. Look at who's on their roster, and sort of start to, you know, look at where they're deficient. Are they really light on middle infield? Is it through injury? Is it through lack of performance? Did they just not draft well and they're deficient in a certain area? Is there a category that they're suffering in? Is their starting pitching looking like an infirmary, you know, where half the guys are hurt and the other half have an ERA over 7? Start to identify needs on that team, and then look on that team and look at what you're lacking in. So if they can help you in a category that you're deficient in, and you can maybe, you know, vice versa, help them out, it's time to start putting together a trade proposal. Another good thing to look at is, remember a few weeks when Elvis Andrus went down? I went to all my other in all my leagues, everybody that had Elvis Andrus, and we're just, you know, down a shortstop. And if I was deep at shortstop at all, I would send them an offer. A little bit on the low ball side, but something to get the conversation started. So let's talk about, speaking of low ball, trade strategies. So, you know, how to go about conducting a trade. So first of all, don't obscenely low ball. If somebody's in a position of weakness, like they just lost their starting shortstop, yeah, okay. Start the conversation with something that's, you know, not quite perfect, but don't send garbage to people, because they're going to stop. They're going to be disillusioned with anything that you send them. They're not even going to have the conversation. With that, don't offer 5 scrubs on your bench for Bryce Harper. Don't take a bunch of crappy players and throw them at them for 1 premium player, or even, you know, 2 pretty good players. Because again, it doesn't resonate with people. People aren't going to go after that. Remember, you're trying to benefit your team, and you're trying to win the trade as well. So rule number 1, you want to benefit your team. You want to better your team, and you want to win the trade. In other words, you either want to make your team benefit more than theirs, you want to win the trade, essentially. You don't want to hurt their team, but you want to hurt their team. Try to avoid making apples to apples offers. When I say apples to apples, don't offer unless you have some sort of a big crush on the pitcher that you're trying to get in return. Don't offer your subpar starting pitcher for their subpar starting pitcher. It doesn't really benefit anybody. Unless, for some reason you think that pitcher on their team is going to do something. Same thing, not a closer for closer or catcher for catcher. Actually look at what they might need and what you might need and make an offer accordingly and try to do a 1-for-1 or a 2-for-2. And then lastly, and there's no other way to put it, but don't be a dick. There's always room to sort of comment on a trade. You don't have to be rude or anything like that. Try to create a rapport. I've turned down trades politely and sort of responded with things that I might be looking for, and ended up a couple weeks later making a successful trade. Having that good rapport and that back and forth. It doesn't have to be adversarial, and you don't have to be a dick. So that's how I want you to manage the first 40 games of your season. So key takeaways of this, I know I threw a lot of information at you, is don't freak out. So don't overreact and start dropping players that you spend a lot of draft capital on. Capitalize on managers that are freaking out and pick those guys up off waivers as aggressively as you can. Target young players on waivers that have a clear path to playing time, that are performing well, that could benefit you through the whole season. Start feeling around for trades, and tinkering with your roster to sort of get it ready for the long run into the season. Because remember, we're going all the way in October here. And that's it. So good luck. Hopefully this gives you the keys to sort of getting your plane off the ground, and off you go.
Put your seatbelt on and yield. It's the apocalypse, yeah!
Why am I going to talk like this?
Put me there. Okay. Ready?